October 1918. The muddy hills of France are covered in the smoke of war. The constant roar of machine guns echoes like unending thunder. Every step taken by an American soldier could be his last. In this brutal setting, a farmer from Tennessee, a simple man, devout, and even reluctant to bear arms, would change the course of a battle and become one of the greatest heroes of World War I. His name was Alvin York. To some, just a backwoods mountaineer. To others, a saint in the midst of hell. But to the soldiers who survived that day, he was the difference between life and death. With only 7 men by his side, he faced more than 100 enemies. He neutralized 35 machine guns, killed at least 25 enemy soldiers, and forced the surrender of 132 German prisoners practically on his own. But this is not just a story of gunfire and numbers. It is the story of how a man who nearly refused to fight found, through faith and courage, the strength to achieve the impossible. To understand Alvin York, we must return to the remote mountains of Tennessee, where he was born on December 13, 1887. The third of 11 children, he grew up in Pall Mall, a small rural community that seemed forgotten by time. Life was harsh. The York family was poor, surviving on whatever the land could provide. His father, William, was a blacksmith and farmer. His mother, Mary, kept the home and cared for the children. Alvin grew up among hills, oxen, corn, and hunting trips, far from modern cities and even farther from the international politics that would one day drag him into war. From an early age, Alvin learned to shoot, not for sport, but out of necessity. Hunting was essential to feed his large family. His marksmanship became legendary in the region. People said he could drop a squirrel without damaging the meat, aiming only at the head. This skill, refined by survival, would later transform a simple man into a formidable soldier. Despite his Christian faith inherited from his mother, Alvin had a turbulent youth. He became known as a brawler and frequenter of saloons. He worked hard in the fields by day, but at night it was common to see him drinking, fighting, and causing trouble. Many neighbors believed Alvin was destined for a life of violence and ruin. But everything changed in 1914. The death of one of his best friends in a bar fight marked him deeply. Alvin turned to the Church of Christ in Christian Union and embraced a life of religious devotion. He became a pacifist, preaching that violence was against God's will. This transformation would directly shape his greatest moral dilemma when war reached the United States. Before he was a hero, Alvin was just another farmer trying to survive. He lived in a modest cabin, worked the land, hunted, and cared for his family. He had little formal education and could never have imagined that one day his name would be known around the world. He did not seek fame. He did not seek glory. He only sought to live in peace. And perhaps that is why his story is so powerful. Because when the world was called to arms, Alvin did not want to go. He fought against his own government in court, seeking recognition as a conscientious objector. He truly believed war was a sin. But World War I left no room for choice. The draft spared no man, not even one like Alvin. And in 1917, against his will, he was conscripted into the United States Army. The pacifist farmer was about to be thrown into the greatest conflict the world had ever seen. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the country was still torn between isolation and international duty. For millions of young men, the war seemed distant, a European conflict that had nothing to do with life in the mountains of Tennessee. But the government instituted the draft. And like so many other men, Alvin York received his call. To him, it felt like receiving a sentence of spiritual death. Alvin was deeply devout. He studied the Bible every night. His religious principles taught him that killing was an unforgivable sin. How could he then put on the uniform and carry a rifle in the name of the state? His conscience rebelled. He did not refuse immediately. He applied for exemption as a conscientious objector, supported by his faith. But his request was denied. The Army saw no place for individual theologies in the midst of a global conflict. For Alvin, it was devastating. He wrote in his diary, "I am in great conflict. I do not want to disobey my country, but I fear offending God." On one side, religious leaders reinforced his pacifist beliefs. On the other, military officers and neighbors reminded him of his responsibility to the nation. Alvin was torn between the cross and the flag. It was more than a choice about war. It was a struggle for his very soul. Despite his resistance, Alvin was sent to Camp Gordon in Georgia, where the 82nd Infantry Division was being formed. At first, he kept to himself. He did not want to hurt anyone. He even avoided discussions about combat tactics. Many fellow recruits saw him as fragile or strange, but soon they realized there was something different about him. The young farmer, who had spent his life hunting in the mountains, proved to be an exceptional marksman. His aim was steady, calm, and natural. While other recruits struggled to hit the target, York aimed and fired with astonishing ease. One officer said, "He was born to shoot." And for the first time, Alvin began to sense that perhaps his skill had a greater purpose. The dilemma still consumed him. Alvin did not want to kill, but neither did he want to be a coward. Then he spent an entire night in prayer, seeking an answer. Hours of silence. Just him, the Bible, and God. And when the sun rose, Alvin stood with a new conviction. Fighting for his country was not a betrayal of his faith, because it was not about killing out of hatred, but about protecting the innocent and putting an end to a greater evil. York later wrote, "A voice told me it was not wrong to defend oneself, that God did not want war, but neither did he want evil to triumph." In that moment, the pacifist was transformed. He still carried his mother's faith, but now he believed his mission was greater, that the rifle in his hands could be an instrument, not of hatred, but of justice. From the divided man, a resolute soldier was born. Alvin would not become a warrior for pleasure, but for duty. His companions began to see him differently, no longer the odd religious man, but someone they could trust in battle. He did not seek medals. He did not dream of glory, but he was ready to do whatever was necessary. And when the 82nd Infantry Division sailed for France in 1918, Alvin York was among them. The farmer from Tennessee was heading straight into the hell of the trenches. In 1918, Alvin York left the Green Mountains of Tennessee to cross the ocean toward a continent in flames. The voyage by ship was long, marked by the constant threat of German submarines. Every wave could hide a torpedo. But upon landing in France, the reality was even harsher. A devastated country. Villages reduced to rubble, fields turned into craters, families displaced, children orphaned. Alvin, who had grown up amid rural simplicity, now faced the rawest portrait of modern war. The trenches of the Western Front were hell itself. Mud up to the knees, a biting cold, the stench of gunpowder mixed with rotting corpses. Water soaked. Their boots, dysentery spread among the men, and rats were constant companions. In the silence of the night, Alvin heard the cries of the wounded stranded in no man's land, impossible to rescue. Artillery fire echoed day and night like thunder. That never ceased. It was a brutal shock for a man who carried a Bible in his pocket. And yet, Alvin adapted. He prayed constantly, but he also became increasingly respected for his calmness, discipline, and incredible marksmanship. The 82nd Division soon entered combat. Alvin took part in patrols, skirmishes, and offensives. In these first battles, his aim saved his comrades. A sergeant reported that when York spotted German snipers, he shot them down with almost supernatural speed, preventing further casualties. Even in the face of violence, Alvin never lost his simple nature. He told his fellow soldiers, "I do not shoot for pleasure, but to protect you." This balance between faith and effectiveness in combat made him a unique figure among the troops. Many began to look to him not only as a comrade in war, but as a moral guide amid the chaos. September 1918, the United States Army launched its largest operation of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It would be the final effort to break through German lines and bring the conflict to an end. The 82nd Division was thrown into the front, and Alvin York was there. The intensity of artillery fire, the crossfire of machine guns, the confusion of orders, all seemed unbearable. It was in this scenario that York would face the greatest test of his life. Within days, his faith, his courage, and his skill would be tested in unimaginable ways. The fate of the battle, and perhaps of the entire war, was about to cross paths with a farmer from Tennessee. The morning of October 8, 1918, began like so many others on the Western Front. A low fog, the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, and the feeling that every step could be the last. The 82nd Division had been ordered to advance as part of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. On paper, the objective was simple: break through the German lines. In practice, it was a labyrinth of machine guns and deadly trenches. York's platoon was sent to flank an enemy position, but it quickly became clear they had walked straight into fortified territory. A storm of bullets surrounded them. German machine guns opened fire from multiple points, cutting men down in seconds. Out of 17 men, only 8 were left standing. Command fell on Alvin York, who until that moment had been just a corporal, a farmer turned soldier. York had two choices: retreat and condemn his entire division to slaughter, or advance alone against a nest of machine guns. He took a deep breath. He remembered the words he had repeated so many times: "Lord, guide my steps." And he advanced. York began to move in a zigzag across the open ground, using every crater as cover. One by one, the German gunners fell to his deadly aim. His marksmanship, sharpened in the Tennessee mountains hunting deer and wild turkeys, became a devastating weapon against seasoned soldiers. When his rifle ammunition was spent, he drew his pistol. A German officer charged him with a bayonet. York dropped him instantly. The enemy fire that had once roared like endless thunder began to fade. The impossible was happening. Alone, Alvin York was silencing 35 machine guns. An entire group of German soldiers watching their comrades fall one after another finally broke. An officer approached with an improvised white flag. York, by himself, forced 132 prisoners to surrender. With only 7 survivors from his platoon, he marched all the captives back to the American lines. One soldier described the scene: "It looked impossible. A single man bringing back an entire company as hostages." When he arrived, many thought it was a hoax, but it wasn't. Alvin C. York, the man who had once hesitated to go to war because of his faith, had just carried out one of the most extraordinary feats in United States military history. That day, in the chaos of Argonne, a farmer from Tennessee changed the course of the battle. When Alvin York presented his 132 prisoners, the officers simply couldn't believe it. It was impossible to imagine that a corporal, a lone man in the open field, had managed to neutralize 35 machine guns and subdue an entire company. Reports began to spread among the troops. Within hours, York's feat was no longer just a rumor. It had become a living legend in the trenches. At first, York was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but soon it was clear that his actions demanded something greater. After an investigation, his deed was elevated to the nation's highest military honor, the Congressional Medal of Honor. And it wasn't only the United States. France decorated him with the Croix de Guerre and the Médaille Militaire. Italy sent him its War Medal. Even tiny Montenegro insisted on honoring him. York had become an international hero, recognized by all the Allied nations. But perhaps the greatest recognition didn't come from medals, but from the symbolic impact. At a moment when the war seemed endless, when families received daily news of sons and husbands killed, York's story became a breath of hope. American newspapers splashed his picture across their front pages. The poor farmer from Tennessee was now called the greatest hero of the Great War. For a country weary of tragedy, York was more than a soldier. He was proof that an ordinary man could change the fate of many. Curiously, while the world saw him as a hero, York still wrestled with his conscience. He never sought glory. He never wanted fame. To him, he had only done what he believed was his duty: to protect his men, complete his mission, and return alive. But whether he liked it or not, his life would never be the same after 1918. When the war ended in November 1918, Alvin York didn't return just as a soldier. He returned as a living legend. At small rural train stations, crowds gathered just to catch a glimpse of him passing by. Children shouted his name. Veterans saluted him, and politicians sought a photograph by his side. But York was not comfortable with the spectacle. To him, it was all an exaggeration. He didn't see himself as a hero, only as a man who had done what needed to be done. Hollywood came knocking at his door. Businessmen offered fortunes to turn his story into advertisements and publicity. But York refused every offer. He believed that commercializing his deed would betray the comrades who never came home. While others chased fame and wealth, York returned to Tennessee and resumed his simple life, working the land and caring for his family. His greatest concern wasn't glory. It was how to improve the lives of his community, where poverty still reigned. York realized that his fame could serve a greater purpose. He used his prestige to raise funds for schools in rural Tennessee. He dreamed of giving poor children in the region a chance he himself never had: a proper education. For years, he traveled across the country, speaking in churches, clubs, and institutions, always asking for support for the cause of education. His name drew attention, and he used it not for himself, but to transform his community. Despite the fame, York never stopped being who he was. He continued living in a modest house, working the land, attending church, and remaining faithful to his roots. A reporter who visited him in the 1920s described it this way: "You'd expect to find a general in a palace. Instead, you find a farmer in simple clothes offering you coffee." This contrast between the grandeur of his deeds and the humility of his life only deepened the fascination Americans felt for him. In the years following the end of the war and the success of his story on the silver screen, Alvin York never allowed himself to be seduced by fame. He continued living in Tennessee, on his farm, surrounded by his wife Gracie and their children. For him, the greatest decoration was not found in medals, but in the simple life and in the faith that had guided him since youth. As time went on, York began to suffer from serious health problems. He battled hypertension, arthritis, and lingering complications from the war. By the 1950s, his mobility was greatly reduced, forcing him to step back from public life. Even so, he never lost his spirit of service. Whenever he could, he welcomed visitors, spoke with young soldiers, and repeated that he did not see himself as a hero, but rather as an instrument of something greater. His name was immortalized in schools, highways, and institutions across Tennessee and the nation. The state of Tennessee founded the Alvin C. York Institute, a public school dedicated to bringing education to rural communities, the very dream he had championed for decades. And so, even far from the battlefields, York continued to shape generations. On September 2, 1964, at the age of 76, Alvin C. York passed away. He was laid to rest with full military honors as the nation paid tribute to one of its greatest heroes. Yet, for those who knew him closely, York did not leave as a celebrity or a legend. He departed as he had lived, a simple man, faithful to his faith and to his land. Today, more than a century after his extraordinary feat, Alvin C. York is still remembered as the perfect example of the citizen soldier, a man who did not seek war but answered the call when it came. His name endures in history books, in films, in monuments, and above all, in the inspiration he offers to every new generation. York reminds us that true greatness does not come from the pursuit of glory, but from the courage to act when destiny demands it. A simple farmer, a man of faith, a reluctant soldier who became a legend. Alvin C. York did not seek war, nor did he seek glory. But when the moment came, he answered the call with courage and determination that changed the course of a battle. His story is not just about bullets, trenches, or medals. It is about the strength that exists within the common man when he chooses to act. York lived and died as he had lived his entire life, humble, devout, devoted to his land and his people. And perhaps that is exactly what makes him immortal. Because heroes like him never truly disappear. They remain alive in every memory, in every lesson of courage, and in every difficult decision that requires more than strength. It requires faith.